Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing
Timothy Miller.
Hi there. How are you today?
Excellent. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to have you back on.
I'm thinking, thank you very much.
Of course, yeah. So can you tell me about your new book?
It is basically, when you strip it all down, it's Sherlock Holmes investigates the murder of Vincent Van Gogh, which a lot of people don't think that Vincent Van Gogh was murdered. They think he committed suicide, but he never had Holmes look at the situation before. And Holmes can tell you from the beginning pretty much that it was murder, and he wants to know why.
And this book is so much fun. It's such a wild ride, just following this mystery. And I really have an interest in artists and artists from that time, and I've studied them a lot. So it was super fun for me to get to be put in like this fictionalized version of that world. How did you know you wanted to set it in France in this time with these historical figures?
Well, it actually began long ago when I knew basically about as much as anybody knows about Van Gogh, which is he's a crazy artist who cut his ear off and killed himself. And I was in a store with a lot of cards, and one of the cards was the self-portrait of Van Gogh after he cut his ear off. And I started thinking, well, I knew that he had cut off his ear supposedly because of his love for a woman. And I said to myself, well, now, if he's an artist, then why didn't he cut an eye out? That would truly show his love. And that started me on a lot of different questions. It really started me down a rabbit hole. And I started learning more and more about him. And I started questioning more and more about him. And so whenever I have a question, I go to Sherlock Holmes, because Sherlock Holmes knows how to figure everything out. So I just questioned everything. I questioned whether he did actually cut his ear off, whether he did actually kill himself, whether he was actually crazy. And I just started seeing it from a different angle entirely.
Yeah. And you create such an interesting story with, well, I don't want to have any spoilers on the show, but it is very interesting what happens. And how did you, as you were writing, because I know you said that you kind of turned to Sherlock Holmes to figure out what it was. Did you outline and know exactly what you were going to do before you started writing, or did you kind of figure it out along with the detectives?
Well, this is the thing, actually. This was actually my first idea for a Sherlock Holmes novel, and I couldn't write it, basically because I couldn't figure out the narrator. And I went back later and turned it into a screenplay. And then, after writing my first book about Sherlock Holmes, I went back and figured out who the narrator was and was able to write the book. So I definitely had the plot down, basically. I had to make a lot of changes from the screenplay, obviously. But the main the main key was finding the narrator, who turned out to be Lerma-Leaf.
Yeah. What was it like taking this, that you had an idea for a book and then turning it into a screenplay and then turning it back into a book?
It was a years-long process. And of course, one of the things that I did not realize when I was writing the screenplay was that you couldn't get the rights to Sherlock Holmes at the time. So once I wrote the screenplay, I tried to get rights, and that was another rabbit hole, just trying to find out who had the rights. And I wound up sending sending the screenplay off to a woman who claimed to have the rights, who I find years later didn't have any rights at all. I mean, the story of rights for Sherlock Holmes is a volume in itself. So I set it aside and continued writing screenplays. And then after I had written the first Sherlock Holmes novel, The Strange Case of Eliza Doolittle, I thought, well, now I can finally write The Strange Case of the Dutch Painter.
Cool. Yeah. With Eliza Doolittle, which I know you talked about last time you were on here, but I was just curious, like, how did that idea come about after this one? Because that one kind of puts in some more like fictional universes instead of like fictionalized historical characters.
Yeah, and it was the same question. Really, was, you know, I had the same question that Pickens had, which was Eliza Doolittle really Eliza Doolittle? And I went to Holmes again to figure it out. It was a different case in that I was dealing entirely with fictional characters in that one, but I always tend to assume that they were real characters. So it wasn't that much different, except I had a little more leeway with their backstories.
With this one, I'd like to talk a little bit about that, like the process of creating a backstory and like working with these people who actually did live.
Yeah, well, luckily, these characters were outsized people to begin with. I mean, you know, we're talking about some of the craziest people in the world to begin with. I mean, we're talking about Toulouse-Lautrec, and we're talking about Paul Gauguin, and we're talking about Theo Van Gogh. And they lived huge lives. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're talking about Vincent Van Gogh, whose life was unfortunately shortened, but he lived a lot during his time. So it wasn't really a question of having to bring them up to size, bring them into fictional characters, but trying to suppress their more fictional aspects to begin with, and to also suppress trying to give their entire stories. I mean, I could have written a whole lot more about Susan Valadon, a whole lot more about Louis Anquetin, a whole lot more about so many characters, and I had to compress them down to a smaller character than I would have liked to.
Do you think that in the future you could see yourself returning to this sort of setting in Paris and this time and these artists?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I would, although I love Paris and I love the art. But I do have an idea for a story with Picasso, which would be in terms of the Mona Lisa. I don't know whether you're aware, but one of the first suspects for the theft of the Mona Lisa was Pablo Picasso.
I hadn't heard that.
Yes. He was quickly exonerated, but what if he wasn't innocent? Anyway, those are the things that go through my mind. It's always, what if? What if this? What if that? And I like to play with these questions that, history can never quite solve, when I first started writing this story, there was never any question that Van Gogh had killed himself. Well, now there's a big, thick book sitting on my desk in which it's posited that he was killed by a couple of kids who happened to be sort of in the neighborhood and were always teasing him, and things got out of hand. So history changes all the time.
Yeah, it does. At what point, like in your writing or just like in your like life in general, did you start like thinking about these questions in terms of Sherlock Holmes, in terms of like a mystery? I don't know if that question makes sense, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I don't know how I mean, I know when I learned about Sherlock Holmes, which was fairly late, actually. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I read all the Sherlock Holmes stories. As a matter of fact, I wasn't that much into mysteries, and I'm still catching up on the whole mystery genre. But it just seemed natural to me. Again, when I had a question, to go to a fictional character and let him try to work it out. I mean, I guess I could have tried to work it out by myself, but why do that when you have Holmes on call?
Yeah, yeah.
Of course, along the way, I learned a great deal about Holmes himself, and his whole backstory intrigues me because there's so little backstory, and I can try to fill that in myself, as I do in part in this book with Père Alphonse, his original teacher.
So there are so many different like retellings and adaptations of Sherlock Holmes and like this character, and so many different interpretations. Do you have a specific one that you can kind of point to and say like, this one is the most like the Sherlock Holmes that I write about?
Well, to tell you the truth, since I started writing about Holmes, I have made sure to read as little of Holmes's pastiches as possible, because I have, especially Watson, in my ear, and I don't want to be confused by anybody else's version of Watson. Now, of course, I began writing pastiches probably because of Nicholas Meyer and the 7% solution. And if I have a master, it's him. And the idea of pairing Holmes with another detective, which he does with Sigmund Freud in the 7% solution, was so strong in me that that's what I did in this story, really, was pair him with another detective, with Yvonne Limmerleaf, as we call him.
That was something that I loved in this book, because it just created such a strong dynamic between the characters, and made it even more interesting to read than like, I feel like a more typical, it's just Sherlock and Watson as the only detectives, and Watson isn't really in this book except like for the epilogue and stuff like that. But I really loved reading that because it felt so much more engaging, because you got to see how like the back and forth between the two people figuring it out actively.
Yeah, well, I mean, I very much wanted someone different from Watson this time. I mean, I definitely wanted a narrator who was not Holmes. Mm-hmm. I do not believe in Holmes as a self-narrator at all. I think it takes away his mystery. But I wanted someone who would not be as accepting of Holmes as Watson is, and not familiar with Holmes, so that we could see Holmes to a new light, and see not only the oddness of his ways, but how he grows on one, and how his decisions come to light, and how they're processed by someone who doesn't know him, and by someone fairly prickly at the same time, someone who has his own ideas and his own sort of detective work.
So now, as you've just mentioned earlier, this is the second book that you've written in this
Yes.
like Holmes pastiche type thing. So which one did you find like easier or harder out of the two? Because I like figuring out the first book, like you have to figure out the characters and all of that, like how you're kind of developing like how you write this character, but also in the second book, like what do you do to continue that story? So what was it like for you?
Well, the second book was, again, probably easier for me in that once I found my narrator, I started out with a omniscient narrator and soon saw the error of my ways in that. Once I had him and realized, that he would have a totally different take on Holmes, and I could really focus on Holmes that way, in a way that I couldn't so much in the first book, although I was able in the first book to show some of Holmes' growth and some of his changes, which will be continued in the third book. But I really, knowing that I was, of course, following in the footsteps of Van Gogh, I was going from Paris to Auvers and Auvers to Arles and Arles to Montpellier and so forth. It was a definitely easier story.
Cool. Yeah. So this is kind of unrelated to the writing process, but I'm just curious, since it is like about the book, do you have a favorite painting of Vincent van Gogh's?
I would say probably the Cafe Terrace at night. If you know the one I'm talking about, it's an incredible lit cafe terrace in that dark blue night, and of course it's lit, solid yellow, which of course for Van Gogh's favorite colors, yellow and blue. I mean, that's you have his irises and his sunflowers, and it gives me sort of an otherworldly feel. It actually reminds me of a book I had as a very young child, which was Darby O'Gill and the Little People. And I remember the cover showed a well and a light coming from the well. And that experience of a light coming from where no light should come from has always stayed with me. And the terrace at night reminds me of that very much.
That is so cool. Yeah, it's an absolutely stunning painting. Yeah, he's just such a brilliant artist.
Oh yes, and people really don't realize. I mean, just the wealth of art that he basically created within 7 years. I mean, since he died at 37, it's really amazing how much. I mean, he was basically putting out, two paintings a day toward the end there, and that's phenomenal.
Yeah, and two paintings of that like caliber of art is like absolutely crazy to think about. That was something that I really kind of like spiked my like curiosity in the book, and made me want to learn some more about like what the like towards the end was like for him. When you mentioned like how much he was painting, and it was so interesting, because I was like, I wonder like how someone could possibly do that, and like what kind of headspace you would have to be in to be just churning out that much, and like how brilliant.
Yes, well, it would be interesting. I mean, I'm not one to try to diagnose Van Gogh, which is a cottage industry in itself, all the different possibilities. But if I had to, I would say that he was probably bipolar, and it would be interesting to question. I've heard that he's bipolar from other sources, and it would be interesting to track exactly his up and down periods according to how many paintings he was putting out at what time and what was going on at the time. I mean, it would be a monumental effort, but it would be interesting to see whether he showed that up and down bipolar aspect.
Definitely. Yeah. And it's also interesting to think about like what would have happened to him if he was alive today, where there's so much more access to resources to help with people's mental health, and there's medication and all these things now that can, like, it's much less stigmatized. Mental health is still stigmatized in the world that we live in, but it's less than it was back then, for sure. And I wonder what kind of art he would have created and what he would have gone on to do had he been alive today.
That's interesting. I'm not sure that he wouldn't have fallen through the cracks anyway, because he was such a solitary figure. Although, of course, not as solitary as he's painted. I mean, when he was around other painters, he was very social and very much a pain in the ass. Oh, excuse me, I probably shouldn't say that.
Oh, it's
but
fine.
Very much pain. And of course, his whole relationship with Gauguin, which was based on him wanting to start a studio of the South, which certainly failed. But I think in his case, he would have still fallen through the cracks. Perhaps after his incident with the ear, he might have had help. But I mean, he sought help at the time, and then basically rejected it. I mean, I've known bipolar people, and of course, all the help in the world will not help when you're not taking your medication, and that's exactly what happens when you're bipolar.
Yeah, it's just
so. But we'll never know.
It's just different for everyone.
Yes, it would certainly be interesting to see. I don't think that his madness fueled his art, because I just don't believe that, in the whole myth of the mad artist, whether he's a mad painter or a mad writer or a mad sculptor, I don't believe that that's necessary to the process.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, but I think really his work in Auvers was far more peaceful than what he had done before. It just strikes me that way.
Yeah. So, kind of going in a different direction, what kind of research did you have to do to learn about art forgeries and all of that type of thing?
Well, luckily, there is no dearth of books on art forgery and art theft. And the only problem really is that there's a whole lot more that I want to read, because it's fascinating. I mean, heist movies are my favorite kind of movies. But the best books that I would actually mention in my acknowledgments are a book I came across called The Deceivers by Aviva Breifel. And it was about 19th century art forgery and art copyist, and sort of the whole hierarchy there. For instance, there's a female copyist that I mentioned in the Louvre were always a step below a forger. They couldn't be considered on a par with an actual forger, because they couldn't be as good, supposedly. Of course, in my book, that's a little different. But it is a really fascinating take, and very well structured and well resourced book on that period. And then the other book was by Eric Hebhorn, The Forger's Handbook, which is by a modern forger who was one of the great forgers of the 20th century. And he breaks down pretty much, exactly how do you forge this? What do you use as far as your canvas and as far as your paints? And he was really a brilliant forger until he finally got caught. And I found that book very useful for understanding the actual nuts and bolts of forgery.
Finding those resources, yeah. And thank you so much for coming on the show today. This was great to chat with you again. I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
I have the third book of my trilogy, of my Holmes trilogy. It is called The Strange Case of the Pharaoh's Heart. And it's taking an immense amount of research, which is still changing my story as I continue to research. It involves 6 murders in 5 different cities, from London to Luxor. And there are 2 narrators that go back and forth. One of them is Watson. The other one is a very famous real spiritual medium named Estelle Roberts, who was a friend of Conan Doyle. And I basically take up from the ending of my first book, in which Holmes has become much more of a spiritualist. And it's basically based on Conan Doyle's involvement with the Curse of King Tut.
Cool. All right. Well, if you want to come back on the show when that book is ready, just let me know, and I would love to chat with you about it. I had a great time talking with you today all about Vincent Van Gogh and Sherlock Holmes. This was lots of fun. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Timothy Miller.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The
end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.